The courtroom was unusually still that early morning, sunlight drifting through tall windows and brushing the wooden benches with a soft glow as murmurs filled the room. When Judge Frank Caprio sat down, calm and fatherly as always, the atmosphere felt steady, until the young woman entered. With purple dreadlocks, sharp eyes, and a posture dripping with entitlement, she walked as if rules were decorations meant for other people. She didn't look at the officers, didn't acknowledge the clerk, didn't even nod toward the judge. She simply took her place like a runway model claiming her stage. People exchanged looks, reactions rippling quietly through the room as she rolled her eyes directly at Judge Caprio, freezing the air for a heartbeat. Judge Caprio is left speechless after this defendant walks in like she owns the courtroom. Someone whispered, feeding the tension. Caprio observed her silently, patient, steady, almost compassionate, taking in the dismissive gestures, the restless tapping of her nails, the hidden insecurity beneath her confident mask. Without waiting for permission, she sighed loudly and said, "Let's get this over with," prompting gasps and stiffened shoulders. But Caprio remained unmoved, offering only a small, thoughtful tilt of his head. And in that moment, the viral courtroom moment quietly began. A faint shift moved through the courtroom as Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, the way he always did when preparing to understand someone rather than confront them. His voice, warm but grounded, cut through the tension with surprising gentleness. "Miss," he said, "before we begin, I'd like to know your name." The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she lifted her chin, flicked one purple dreadlock behind her shoulder, and gave a small scoff that echoed far louder than she intended. "Does it matter?" she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few people shook their heads. One older man in the back whispered, "She's digging her own grave with that attitude." But Caprio didn't react to the disrespect. He watched her with a patient curiosity, as if he were searching for the reason behind the mask she wore so tightly. "It matters," he replied softly, "because you matter." The room fell silent at those words, unexpected, almost disarming. For a split second, her expression faltered, but she quickly pulled the arrogance back into place like a shield. "Fine," she snapped. "It's Kiara. Are we done?" Her voice trembled at the end, just barely. A crack only someone like Caprio would notice. He nodded slowly, letting her save face. "Kiara," he repeated, as if the name itself carried weight. "Let's take this one step at a time." She rolled her eyes again, but less sharply this time. And behind her defiance, something small but real flickered, uncertainty, fear, or maybe a battle she didn't want anyone to see. Judge Caprio glanced down at the file before him, not with irritation but with a quiet, contemplative patience. "Kiara," he began, "you're here today for 3 separate violations: expired registration, 2 unpaid parking tickets, and a failure to appear." The list alone prompted murmurs across the room. Kiara shifted her weight, arms crossing defensively, nails tapping a rapid rhythm against her sleeve. Yeah, I know," she said sharply. "I told the last officer, my life is busy. I can't be everywhere at once." Her tone carried arrogance, but beneath it, there was a tremor, an edge of something unspoken. Caprio lifted his gaze, his eyes steady and almost fatherly. "We all have busy lives," he said softly. "But these aren't small oversights. Missing court is serious." She rolled her eyes again, but this time it looked forced, like the expression no longer fit her face as comfortably as before. "Look, Judge, I don't need a lecture. Just tell me the fine so I can go." A few gasps fluttered through the audience. One woman whispered, "She has no idea who she's talking to." But Caprio remained calm, almost serene. He closed the file slowly, folded his hands, and leaned back in his chair. "Kiara," he said, his voice lowering into something firm but gentle, "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to understand you." She froze, just for a second, as if those words hit a part of her she didn't expect anyone to touch. Her expression tightened, jaw clenching, eyes flicking away as though looking directly at him would reveal too much. "There's nothing to understand," she muttered. but even she didn't sound convinced. The judge let a few quiet seconds pass, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. Kiara kept her arms crossed, shoulders tense, pretending she didn't feel every pair of eyes in the room pressing against her facade. Judge Caprio finally spoke, his tone softer than anyone expected. "When someone says there's nothing to understand," he said, "it often means there's something they're trying very hard to hide." A ripple ran through the room, people shifting, listening more closely. Kiara scoffed, but her eyes flickered downward for a fraction of a second. "I'm not hiding anything," she insisted, voice rising defensively. "I just don't like being here." Caprio nodded thoughtfully. "Most people don't," he replied. "But most people don't walk into a courtroom acting like they're above it." That line landed. Kiara's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth to argue but closed it again, unable to find a retort that didn't reveal too much. Judge Caprio leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench. "Kiara, I want to ask you something. And I want you to answer honestly." She hesitated, her confidence wavering. "What?" she snapped, but the edge in her voice was thinner now. "Why did you miss your court date?" The question seemed simple, too simple. But Kiara froze completely, staring at him with an expression that flickered between annoyance and fear. Her lips pressed together. The tapping of her nails stopped. She looked away, blinking hard as if pushing back something she didn't want to feel. The courtroom fell silent, waiting. Caprio didn't push. He simply watched her with patient, unwavering understanding. And for the first time since she walked in, Kiara's armor showed a real crack. Kiara swallowed hard, her throat tightening as the question hung in the air like a spotlight she couldn't escape. For a moment she tried to summon her earlier arrogance, straightening her posture, lifting her chin, but it didn't hold the same weight anymore. "Why does it matter?" she muttered, staring at the floor. Her voice lacked its former sharpness, it wavered, thin and unsteady. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice, didn't lean back in disappointment. Instead, he leaned closer, his expression calm, almost inviting. "Because missing court is not a small decision," he said gently. "Sometimes it means someone is overwhelmed. Sometimes it means they're scared. Sometimes it means they're dealing with something heavier than a ticket." The room felt impossibly quiet, no whispers, no shifting, not even the faint creak of wooden benches. Kiara's breathing grew uneven, her fingers twitching at the edge of the podium as she fought to keep her composure. "I wasn't scared," she said quickly, too quickly. "I just forgot. It slipped my mind. Whatever." But her voice betrayed her. Even a few spectators exchanged looks, recognizing the crack widening. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, acknowledging her answer without accepting it. "Kiara," he said softly, "you're a smart young woman. And I don't believe for a second that something as serious as a court date simply slipped your mind." Her head shot up, her eyes flashing, not with arrogance this time, but with panic, raw and unfiltered. "You don't know anything about me," she snapped, but her voice trembled. Caprio didn't move, didn't blink. "You're right," he said gently. "I don't. But I'd like to." For the first time, Kiara looked lost. Not angry. Not superior. Just a young woman standing alone in front of a truth she'd been running from. Kiara's lips parted as if she wanted to fire back another sharp remark, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted around the room, the officers, the spectators, the clerk. Every pair of eyes suddenly felt like a weight on her shoulders. She clenched her jaw, trying to force her expression back into something cold, something untouchable. But the harder she tried, the more her mask slipped. Judge Caprio watched her gently, not as a judge towering above her, but as a human being offering a space safer than she expected. "Kiara," he said quietly, "take a breath. You're not in trouble right now. You're in a moment where you get to tell the truth." She inhaled sharply, as if the air itself was heavy. I don't want to talk about it," she muttered. Her voice cracked at the end, so faint most people would have missed it, except Caprio didn't miss anything. You don't have to explain everything, he replied, his tone steady and warm. Just help me understand what kept you away. She squeezed the edge of the podium, her knuckles widening. The arrogance that once radiated off her had faded into something fragile. People always assume the worst, she whispered suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. They always think I'm irresponsible or selfish or whatever. The vulnerability in her voice made the room lean in. Even the officers softened their posture. Caprio nodded kindly. I'm not here to assume, he said. I'm here to listen. Kiara shut her eyes tight, her breath catching as though she was holding back a truth that had been locked up for far too long. When she opened them again, the fight in her expression had changed. It wasn't defiance anymore, it was exhaustion. And that shift, subtle but unmistakable, was the beginning of her unraveling. Kiara took another shaky breath, gripping the podium so tightly her rings pressed into her skin. She stared at a spot on the floor, as if looking Judge Caprio in the eyes would make everything spill out too fast. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I had somewhere to be that day. The room stayed silent, waiting. Caprio didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, encouraging her to continue. Somewhere more important than court? He asked gently. Kiara hesitated, then shook her head. No, not more important, she muttered, swallowing. Just something I couldn't avoid. Her breath hitched. The audience leaned forward, but not out of judgment, out of curiosity, drawn into the unraveling truth. Caprio leaned back slightly, giving her space. Kiara, I'm not here to embarrass you, he said softly. If there's something complicated in your life, you can share it at your pace. She wiped at her nose subtly, trying to hide the gesture as if emotions were a form of weakness. It was my mom, she said abruptly. The words spilled out before she could stop them. Caprio's expression softened even further. Your mom? He repeated, inviting her to continue. Kiara nodded stiffly. She had an appointment. A medical one. And she didn't want to go alone. Her voice trembled again, revealing the depth of the truth pressing against her. She gets anxious in hospitals, Kiara continued, blinking rapidly. And that day she was worse than usual. I couldn't leave her. I just couldn't. The courtroom felt smaller, quieter, as the emotional tide shifted completely. The arrogance that once defined her entrance was now replaced by something raw, human, and unexpectedly tender. For the first time, people weren't judging her, they were understanding her. Judge Caprio nodded, his eyes warm with recognition. You were taking care of your mother, he said gently. That's not irresponsibility, Kiara. That's love. Kiara's shoulders trembled as if the simple acknowledgement of her intentions, something she'd expected to be dismissed or mocked, unlocked a pressure she'd been carrying alone for far too long. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral, but her voice betrayed her. You don't get it, she murmured. People think I'm this arrogant, selfish girl who doesn't care about anything. But they don't see what's actually happening. Judge Caprio tilted his head, listening with full, deliberate attention. Then help me see, he said gently. Kiara's eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears away before they could fall. My mom's been sick for a long time, she said. Not something dramatic, nothing that gets sympathy. Just the kind of illness that drains you slowly. The kind that makes you scared all the time. She exhaled shakily. She hides it from people. And I'm the only one she lets close enough to help. A murmur of empathy passed through the courtroom. Suddenly her purple dreadlocks, her proud walk, her razor-sharp tone, they all looked less like arrogance and more like armor a young woman wasn't ready to admit she needed. Caprio nodded in understanding, but didn't interrupt. Kiara continued, her voice cracking. The day of the court date, she had this appointment. She looked at me like... She paused, swallowing hard. Like she was terrified. Like if I didn't come with her, she wouldn't go at all. Her breath faltered. I made a choice. And maybe it was the wrong one legally, but morally? She shook her head, tears clinging to her lashes. I wasn't going to abandon her. The courtroom felt suspended in a collective breath. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his eyes warm, full of quiet gravity. Kiara, he said softly, sometimes compassion looks like disobedience. But that doesn't make it wrong. Kiara blinked rapidly, trying to collect herself, but her composure was gone. The audience watched, rapt, as the young woman who had stormed in with arrogance and defiance now looked smaller, more human, real. Judge Caprio didn't lecture or scold. He simply gave her the space to breathe, to process, to feel seen. You acted out of love, he said, letting the words hang in the quiet courtroom. And that is never something to be ashamed of. Kiara's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, to push back, but the usual defenses didn't rise. She had nothing left to hide. She exhaled, her fingers loosening their grip on the podium. I didn't think anyone would understand that, she whispered, voice barely audible, yet resonant in the hush. Caprio nodded, gentle but firm. It's easy to assume the worst about someone based on appearances, he said. But every story has layers. Every person has reasons you might never see at first glance. The room stayed silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Kiara's eyes flicked to the spectators. Faces that had once seemed judgmental now held curiosity, empathy, even a hint of respect. She had walked in armored and untouchable, and now the armor was falling away, block by block, under the careful, patient observation of a man who refused to judge without understanding. Her defiance had not vanished. It had transformed, softened by recognition, by acknowledgement, by the unspoken understanding that her truth mattered. And in that stillness, the courtroom itself seemed to lean forward, leaning into the vulnerability unfolding before it. A subtle shift had settled over the courtroom. The tension that had hung like a thick fog melted just enough to let a quiet understanding seep in. No one spoke, no one moved. The young woman's gaze dropped to her hands, still gripping the edge of the podium, but the rigid posture was softening. Judge Caprio's calm presence filled the space, a gentle anchor in the storm of her emotions. Caring for someone you love can sometimes put you at odds with rules, he said, his voice steady, compassionate. It doesn't make you wrong. It makes you human. The words landed differently this time. They weren't a lecture, they weren't a rebuke, they were an acknowledgement of a truth that had been buried under layers of fear, pride, and expectation. A quiet breath escaped her lips, a surrender she hadn't allowed herself in years. The spectators shifted in their seats, drawn in by the unfolding transformation, feeling the shift in energy as the arrogance that had defined her entrance faded into something raw and authentic. Caprio leaned forward slightly, encouraging without pushing. Sometimes the world judges quickly, he continued softly. But understanding, that takes time. It takes patience. And it begins by listening. Her eyes flicked up briefly, a mixture of relief and vulnerability surfacing in the expression she tried to hide for so long. The courtroom had changed. It was no longer a place of conflict but a space for revelation. The morning light caught the strands of purple hair falling across her face, highlighting a fragility that had been invisible beneath the bravado. And with that, the story was no longer about a ticket or a court date. It was about choice, love, and the quiet courage of doing what feels right when no one is watching. For the first time, she let herself exhale fully, the tension in her shoulders loosening just enough to feel the weight she had carried alone. Caprio watched silently, giving space while silently guiding her toward the lesson he knew she needed to see. The courtroom, too, felt different. Spectators leaned forward, sensing the authenticity of the moment, the fragility of a young person forced to confront her own heart. It takes courage to make hard choices, he said softly, especially when they might not make sense to others. She swallowed, a lump in her throat, and looked down at the polished wood beneath her hands. There were no smug glances now, no dismissive gestures, just a young woman facing the consequences of her actions while recognizing why she had made them. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her feel the gravity of both responsibility and compassion. Life isn't only about rules, he continued. It's about understanding the lives of others, and acting with empathy even when it's inconvenient. Her fingers loosened further, and she shifted slightly, a small gesture, but one that revealed she was listening, really listening, for the first time that morning. The lesson wasn't about fines, tickets, or court appearances anymore. It was about integrity, compassion, and the quiet power of making choices that honor what truly matters. And in that moment, she understood, in a way she hadn't allowed herself before, that being human meant balancing mistakes with care, defiance with understanding, and pride with vulnerability. The courtroom's energy shifted subtly, but unmistakably. A transformation was taking place before everyone's eyes. The room remained silent, the usual murmurs and shuffling replaced by a rare stillness that hung heavy in the air. She pressed her hands together, knuckles pale, as if grounding herself in the moment. Caprio's voice, calm and deliberate, broke through the quiet. "You've carried a lot," he said. "More than most people can see. And yet you walked in here today, strong, defiant, and honest all at once. That takes more courage than you realize." Her eyes flicked up briefly, searching his for judgment, but found none. Only understanding. The spectators held their breath, caught in the intimacy of the revelation. "Sometimes," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "we mistake pride for strength and arrogance for protection. But real strength is being willing to admit when life overwhelms us, when our choices matter more than appearances." She exhaled softly, a trembling smile threatening to break through, quickly suppressed. For the first time, she felt seen, not for the bravado, not for the exterior she had built, but for the person underneath, scared, caring, human. Caprio didn't rush her. He let the silence speak, letting the lessons sink in organically. And gradually, the tension melted into something lighter, something resembling relief. She shifted her weight, shoulders easing, a subtle acknowledgement that the armor she had worn so tightly was no longer necessary. The courtroom had transformed alongside her, a living witness to the quiet power of empathy and understanding, and she was beginning to realize that sometimes the rules of the law aren't the only things that define right and wrong. A soft murmur ran through the courtroom as people began to sense the shift. Her defiance had faded into something tentative, a fragile honesty that was more compelling than any arrogance she had shown before. Judge Caprio's eyes softened further, reflecting a deep compassion that seemed to absorb the tension in the room. "It's not always easy to show your heart," he said, "especially when it feels like the world is ready to judge you at every step. But honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is a kind of bravery few recognize." She looked down, fingers fidgeting, then slowly lifted her gaze to meet his again. A small spark of understanding flickered in her eyes, a recognition that she wasn't being punished, only guided toward seeing herself and her choices clearly. The spectators, drawn into the raw intimacy of the moment, leaned forward, silent witnesses to a transformation unfolding before them. Caprio's voice softened further, almost a whisper. "The most important lessons aren't learned from fines or tickets. They're learned from realizing the impact of your actions and the love you carry into every choice." She exhaled, a shaky but genuine sound, and for a brief moment, the armor she had relied on for so long seemed unnecessary. Her posture softened, the rigid lines replaced by a subtle vulnerability. The courtroom itself seemed lighter, the sunlight catching her purple dreadlocks in a warm glow, illuminating the humanity that had been hidden beneath bravado. And as the judge observed her, a quiet truth settled over the room: people can change, if only they're given the chance to be understood. She shifted slightly, a faint tremor in her hands as if the words had unlocked something long buried. Judge Caprio didn't rush her. He simply let the silence do part of the work. "You see, rules are important," he said softly. "But understanding why someone acts as they do is even more so. Compassion doesn't cancel responsibility, but it gives it meaning." Her lips parted, uncertain, caught between relief and lingering defensiveness. A few spectators leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the moment. She exhaled, a quiet acknowledgement escaping her, not through words but through the subtle easing of tension in her shoulders. Caprio continued, voice steady and warm. "Life often puts us in situations where the right choice isn't clear-cut. You made a choice based on care, not convenience. That deserves recognition. Her eyes glistened faintly, the usual arrogance nowhere to be seen. She looked toward the benches, then back to the judge, and for the first time, allowed herself to see that her actions, though technically a violation, were rooted in love, not neglect. The room seemed to hold its breath, witnessing a transformation that had begun quietly but now radiated outward. Judge Caprio's patience and gentleness had created a space where honesty could bloom, revealing the courage it takes to prioritize humanity over rigid rules. The energy in the courtroom had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer just a defendant, but a person understood, a lesson embodied, and a story unfolding that would stay with everyone present long after the gavel fell. A faint tension remained, but it was no longer the sharp, prickly defiance she had carried in. Her movements were slower now, measured, as if each gesture was being weighed against the truths she had finally allowed herself to acknowledge. Caprio observed quietly, letting the stillness speak volumes. "You've shown something important today," he said, voice calm yet filled with gentle authority. "It's not just about following rules, it's about how we act when life demands more from us than we expected." She swallowed hard, the words sinking in, and for the first time her gaze softened. The audience leaned forward, captivated not by drama but by authenticity. The young woman's purple dreadlocks shimmered subtly in the morning light, and her posture hinted at exhaustion mingled with relief. Caprio continued, "The choices we make out of love, out of care, often carry weight beyond any ticket or fine. They teach us about responsibility, empathy, and the courage it takes to act rightly when no one is watching." She exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, as though she was letting go of a burden she hadn't fully recognized until now. No words of defiance escaped her. Instead, a quiet acknowledgement settled over her features, a mixture of relief and understanding. The courtroom remained hushed, witnessing not a punishment, but a transformation, a young person confronted with her actions, guided by compassion, and learning a lesson that would stay with her far beyond that morning. In that moment, the viral impact was undeniable. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a glimpse into the raw power of patience, empathy, and human connection. Her hands loosened from the edge of the podium, fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood as if testing the reality of the moment. Judge Caprio's presence remained calm and grounding, the kind that made it impossible to maintain pretense. "Life will often place us in situations where the rules conflict with our conscience," he said softly. "It's in those moments that character is revealed, not by what we follow blindly, but by what we choose with integrity." She nodded slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible motion, but it carried the weight of acknowledgement. The room seemed suspended, spectators holding their collective breath, feeling the weight of her transformation. A faint tear slid down her cheek, quickly wiped away, yet it didn't go unnoticed. Caprio's voice continued, warm and deliberate. "Courage isn't loud. It doesn't boast. It shows up quietly, in the choices no one else sees, in the care we extend when it's inconvenient." Her chest rose and fell more steadily, the tension in her shoulders finally releasing. The courtroom, once a place of judgment and whispers, felt softer now, infused with a sense of understanding and empathy. For her, the morning had shifted from confrontation to revelation, from defiance to reflection, and she began to see the implications of her actions beyond the immediate consequences. Caprio's patient guidance had opened a window into a deeper truth, that life's lessons are rarely about punishment, and often about the courage to do what's right when no one is watching. She lifted her gaze fully this time, meeting the judge's eyes with a mixture of vulnerability and newfound clarity. The arrogance that had colored her entrance was gone, replaced by a subtle humility that spoke louder than any words could. Caprio's voice, steady and soft, filled the quiet space. "Acknowledging our choices and their impact is the first step toward growth. It isn't always easy, and it doesn't always feel fair, but it's how we learn to live with integrity." She exhaled, a sound mingled with relief and lingering tension, and let her shoulders drop slightly. Around the courtroom, spectators shifted in their seats, moved by the authenticity unfolding. The young woman who had once seemed untouchable now stood exposed, human, yet somehow stronger for it. Caprio continued without hurry. Mistakes aren't failures if we take the lessons they carry. You chose to be present for someone you love, and that shows a depth of character most people never reveal. She blinked, swallowing hard, absorbing the weight of his words, realizing that what she had thought of as recklessness was, in fact, an act of courage. A faint smile, tentative but real, broke across her face, and for the first time, the courtroom felt lighter. The morning light illuminated her purple dreadlocks, casting a warm glow over the moment of transformation. And silently, everyone present sensed that this wasn't just about a fine or a court date anymore. It was a story of humanity, compassion, and the quiet strength of doing what is right, even when it's hard. The courtroom remained still, the air charged with a quiet reverence. She shifted on her feet, not out of defiance, but as if trying to center herself after the emotional tide that had swept over her. Caprio's calm voice guided the moment, gentle yet firm. You've faced a difficult choice today, one that could have been hidden behind excuses or arrogance. Instead, you stood here and allowed the truth to be seen. She swallowed, a lump in her throat, and looked down for a moment, struggling to find the words to respond. The spectators felt the gravity of her transformation, their eyes quietly reflecting the empathy that had grown in the room. The courage to act with care, even when it's inconvenient or misunderstood, is the kind that changes lives. He continued, pausing to let it sink in. Her chest rose and fell with steadier breaths, the tension in her posture softening further. A small, almost imperceptible nod confirmed that she understood, not just the judge's words, but their deeper meaning. Caprio offered a faint, reassuring smile, never condescending, only acknowledging her journey. The courtroom had shifted from a place of confrontation to one of understanding, where the young woman's choices were recognized for their humanity rather than judged merely as violations. And in that quiet transformation, the spectators realized they had witnessed something rare, a genuine moment of reflection, learning, and the subtle, profound power of compassion guiding justice. Her gaze lingered on the floor for a moment, then slowly lifted to meet the judge's eyes. The defiance that had dominated her entrance had completely dissolved, replaced by something quieter, more grounded. Judge Caprio's voice, soft yet unwavering, filled the courtroom. Kiara, what you've shown today is more than just accountability. It's empathy. It's understanding that life is complicated, and that sometimes doing the right thing isn't the easiest path. She exhaled, a shaky but genuine breath, as though releasing a weight she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. Around her, the spectators watched in respectful silence, moved by the transformation that had taken place. Caprio leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady, yet gentle, guiding the moral of the story to its inevitable conclusion. The choices we make, especially when they're difficult, define who we are far more than the mistakes themselves. You acted with care, with courage, and with honesty. That is something to be proud of. A faint smile appeared on her lips, subtle but unmistakable. The courtroom had shifted from a place of tension to a place of reflection. And in that moment, everyone present felt the impact of witnessing a human heart revealed, a young woman transformed, and a judge whose patience and compassion had quietly guided the journey to a meaningful lesson. The gavel finally fell, but the room didn't exhale immediately. The impact of what had just unfolded lingered in the air. She stepped back, a mixture of relief and introspection painting her features. Caprio's eyes met hers one last time, calm, kind, and full of understanding. Remember this, not as a punishment, but as a lesson, he said softly. Life will test your choices, and it's the compassion behind them that truly matters. She nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the truths she had discovered, not in lectures or fines, but in patience and empathy. As she walked toward the exit, the courtroom seemed lighter, the sunlight catching her purple dreadlocks and the subtle smile that now reflected a genuine transformation. Spectators whispered quietly, some with tears in their eyes, others with silent admiration, all sensing that they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just a courtroom hearing, but a story of humanity, responsibility, and the quiet courage of caring for someone beyond oneself. Even after she left, the energy lingered, A reminder that moments of compassion and understanding could leave a lasting mark, changing lives in ways rules alone never could. And as the door closed behind her, Judge Caprio leaned back slightly, a small, satisfied smile touching his lips, knowing that justice had been served not only through law, but through empathy, and a young woman had learned the profound power of choosing love over convenience.